All right, it is 2 o'clock Central, so welcome back to the fourth session of GameRT's March Mini Conference on Building Character. I'm Rebecca Strang, your moderator for this session, and I use she, they pronouns. I am a Children's Services Librarian at Naperville Public Library in Illinois, and I've also been on the GameRT board since 2019, currently serving as past president. This session will run from now until 3 p.m. Central, and it is being recorded and live streamed to Twitch. All recordings of sessions will be available on our Twitch channel after this event. Copies of the slides for presentations are linked in the conference group resource document, which will be linked in chat. And for this session, we'll have 3 presentations followed by a group Q&A period. If you have questions for presenters, please let us know who your question is directed to and use the Zoom Q&A function if you are with us on Zoom. If you've never used the Zoom Q&A feature before, please see the note about it that is being added to chat. If you're watching on Twitch, our Twitch team will snag your questions to add to our Zoom Q&A. We will have a Q&A for all of our presenters at the end of the session block. All of that said, we will go get started. First up is Madi Hopkins with a presentation on building community, one tabletop at a time. It's all yours, Madi.
Thanks. All right. Every Sunday for nearly 2 years, there's a game of Dungeons and Dragons whose characters included a matronly healer, off to seek adventure now that her kids are grown, an angsty teenage half-dark elf eager to pick fights with everyone, and a scholar out to learn more about the ancient past and prove herself to, well, herself. Their players were a labor and delivery nurse who played when not on night shift, a father of 2 who made time to play around various family obligations, and me, 5,000 miles and several time zones away. Besides D&D as a group, we don't have much in common. But despite that, I still have just as much fun playing with them as I do my other regular game, which includes longtime friends. Getting a group together to play D&D is notoriously hard. Adult schedules often conflict with each other, and that's even once you've found people you do want to play with. But before that, making friends is hard. As you can probably guess, I have a solution to that. Libraries. One Boston area writer, Sadie Trombetta, said that on moving to a new city, she made fast friendships in an old familiar place, the library. She did that not just by going to a library, but by going to events with other people interested in the same things as her, which in our case is tabletop role-playing games or TTRPGs. But how does going and playing TTRPGs with other people translate to making friends? We often put something of ourselves in our characters. At the beginning, I mentioned that in a recent game, I played a scholar. I myself am currently a student. Moore was an artificer, an inventor trying to recreate some of the grand constructs of a bygone era. That was on purpose. I have a habit of poking my nose into things I probably shouldn't while playing games, trying to figure out what they are. Building a character around that was a great way to make that feel more intentional. A bit less intentionally, Moore is also someone that ended up being very protective of her friends. Another thing I've since learned is a habit of mine in gameplay. Because there were things about myself that ended up in Mora, those were things that the other players at the virtual table could pick up on. I've learned things about the other players through their characters, too. Take that matronly cleric, the healer played by the nurse. Whereas my character was looking to protect her friends, the cleric was trying to take care of them, which, a cleric played by a nurse, who would have guessed? The angsty half-elf, his player's last character had been a dwarf always trying to do the right thing, whether or not the player wanted to do the right thing in-game. That right thing may not have been the most optimal choice in the moment. This new character was a good way to stretch those muscles and look for the best choice, even if it wasn't the nicest choice. You can even learn things about the game master through play. For instance, our GM was running a game that at several points was quite challenging to the characters. Huge, mazy dungeons full of weird, powerful creatures. We appreciated the challenges. Challenges can be fun. Except that, to the GM, that level of challenge can end up feeling mean, and our GM is almost incapable of being mean. When I described the group earlier, I mentioned that outside of D&D, we would have little reason to interact with each other. Because we play together, though, we do. We wish each other happy birthdays, keep up with how everyone's pets are doing, and generally talk about our lives. Almost like we've become friends with each other or something. And friend groups like that can be good for you. Having friends of different ages is mutually beneficial for both the older and younger friends. It can help provide new perspectives, for instance, as is a group of friends of people from diverse backgrounds. Playing TTRPGs together, that is, solving problems and working together, can also help build teamwork and bonds between the people who participate. So then D&D and other games can bring people together, even those who might not otherwise get together, if, that is, you can find other people to play with. In D&D cliché, players meet for the first time in a tavern where they might be approached by someone who'd heard they were looking for work. For my Sunday game, I was approached by someone who'd heard I'd been wanting to play D&D and brought me into the group. But if you don't have someone who brings you in for a game, how do you find a group? That's often the first roadblock to playing multiplayer games, finding multiple players. Convoy Ventures lists 3 barriers of entry to play: finding a group, finding a GM, and learning the rules. Libraries can help remove each of these 3 barriers of entry. To start with, how do you find a group? Usually you have to talk to people, and people can be scary. Libraries, however, are not scary. Common places to play TTRPGs in person include other people's houses, which probably means already knowing a group who plays, so this isn't necessarily much of a barrier, or game stores, which might be intimidating to those new to the hobby or represent a monetary investment players might not be ready to make. People might not normally think of libraries as a place to look for games, but they can be a safe, neutral place where people can come together in a public setting, often for free. A few months back, I participated in a program at my library we called RPG speed dating. The goal was to introduce people to a variety of RPGs in a short time frame, speed dating style. One participant reported being happy that the library was doing an event like this because she didn't feel comfortable going to game stores, but knew she'd be safe at the library. In my experience, there are a lot of people out there interested in learning how to play a game. Or maybe they know theoretically how to play a game, but they're not really sure where to start. Having library events that are beginner-friendly and accessible can be a good way to make a library feel like a safe place to learn that new skill. The next barrier would be finding a GM, or Game Master, the person who leads the story in many TTRPGs and is often seen as knowing the rules more than most players. Although there are online tools to help people connect to GMs, and maybe game stores have GMs to come in to run games, this is often a paid role. That is, players will pay in order to participate in games. For some players, that might not be within budget. For others, the idea of spending money on a game that you're not sure you'll enjoy is a turnoff. This is another way libraries can come into play, not just getting people together to play the games, but also providing someone to run them. That helps take care of finding people to play with, as well as helping get GMs to run a game. Then there's that last barrier. Learning how to play is easier for some games than others. Although some games have made efforts to make getting started easier, and some games are relatively rules light, many TTRPG rulebooks are hundreds of pages long. Simply reading through the rulebook, once you get past the sheer size of it, is not always enough to really understand how the game's played. You need time at a table with dice or cards or whatever a given game uses. Finding not just a group to play with, but a group willing to help new players learn can be hard to do. Libraries can offer free games of TTRPGs or events to help learn how to play. This past Tuesday, for example, I held a character creation program that focused on the process of creating a D&D 5e character. Although each participant left with a filled-in character sheet, the primary goal was really learning how to read the book and what the different options are. In the past, I've also held events I've called First Adventures, which is a very short adventure played with a group of new players over the course of a couple of hours. So we had plenty of time to discuss character sheets and what to do in different situations, exploring, social interaction, and combat. This can be a good way to break down a complicated game. But, because there's a but, in a blog post titled "Complex Rule Systems Are Inherently Exclusionary," the author describes feeling alienated after spending some time trying to learn the game they'd been wanting to play because they couldn't pick up on the rules easily. They're complicated, and there's a lot of them. This can make it hard to run a game as well, not just play it. So how do we actually run these games? At some libraries, games might be run by a willing volunteer, and that's great. In the cases that a staff member will be running the games, I've got a few tips for some different resources and how they can help. D&D Beyond is one you may have heard of. It can be a good resource full of rules and creatures for D&D. It can be used for character creation as well. But a lot of those resources are locked behind one kind of paywall or another. One way I like to use it is to filter through all of the monsters and magical items to find ones that fit what I'm looking for. In my library, we have the Dungeon Master's Guide and the Monster Manual. So I might filter through for those things that fall within those books, as well as other things I'm looking to find, a low-level monstrosity, for example. Then I can more easily pull that information up in the books that we have. But as much as I like D&D Beyond, it is limited to just D&D. Roll20 is another common one. It's a virtual tabletop, which means players can get together and play the game within its website. My group, with our players spread so far apart, uses it as an example. But it could be a good way to play a game virtually through a library program. It also has a rules compendium, meaning that you can learn basic rules through it, although the full rule set is something that one would need to pay for. This can be a great way to get an idea of different game systems ahead of time. And it's not just D&D that's on Roll20, it's a lot of games. Pathfinder, Call of Cthulhu, Shadowrun, Kids on Bikes, they have a lot. And some of those games even have free quick start resources available on Roll20 or on their websites. Many games also need maps. Dungeon Scroll is one example of a free online map making tool that can be used. With it, you can make simple maps for dungeons. There are other map making tools out there, some of which can be used to make world maps or outdoor battle maps like Incarnate. My library also has reversible wet erase battle maps like this. So there are still grid lines, but we can make maps just using markers. You can go even simpler than that, though. A piece of butcher paper is plenty of space to draw out some quick trees, buildings, or dungeon walls. You can sort of guesstimate distances, or if you prefer, you can make simple templates to measure distances. This one's just a circle with a hole in the middle for a player's mini. This particular size represents 6 inches. That's 30 feet in D&D, a typical one-round movement speed. And what about minis? These little game pieces can add up fast, but there are ways around that. You can use meeples or pawns from other games. Just remember where you got them from. You can use dice if you have enough to roll and also use to represent characters. Or you can even just find a map or picture to use as inspiration and play everything out theater of the mind style. That is, without physical representation. For some games, that's the expectation. D&D is certainly popular. There are many articles out there attributing its rise in popularity to live play streams like Critical Role, or tie-ins with shows like Stranger Things. But here's the thing, as popular as it is, and as much as I like and understand D&D, it's not the game for everyone. For one, it's meant to be played in a sort of traditional fantasy setting with an emphasis on combat. If you want a game in a different setting or a stronger emphasis on some other aspect of play, D&D probably isn't the game for you. Maybe not similar games like Pathfinder either. One could try Cyberpunk Red, for instance, a sci-fi game that the recent video game Cyberpunk 2077 is based on. Call of Cthulhu, now in its 7th edition, is a horror game based on the H.P. Lovecraft story by the same name. Some games are more rules-light than others, which is one way to make the learning the rules barrier an easier hurdle to face. Many games built on Powered by the Apocalypse, for example, use fewer rules and simpler character sheets to help facilitate a story-led game. Those games include Monster of the Week and Avatar Legends, a game based on TV shows Avatar: The Last Airbender and Legend of Korra. Other games can also be a good way to cut down on the rules learning without cutting out rules altogether. Goblin Quest is a great fantasy-feeling game with a smaller rulebook. Or do you like Stranger Things, but you want to be the characters, not just play D&D like them? Kids on Bike might be a good option. Before I started playing D&D, I thought that I wasn't nerdy enough to play. Sure, I was nerdy, but not that nerdy, right? Some games aren't just a rules-light TTRPG, they're cut down to a single page to make getting started extremely easy. I've done games with Delivery Dragons a few times, which is a great game that's easy to pick up and start playing all at once. It features small dragons making a delivery. Plus, it aims to raise awareness for the USPS. A Familiar Problem is another one-page TTRPG that can be a great way to just start playing. Tiniest Wizard isn't just one page, it's the size of a business card. These games sometimes have fewer rules than a board game. This can be a great transition to TTRPGs without feeling like as much as it's a lot to get into or too nerdy in its complexity. Removing those barriers can be important to helping people join the hobby. It can be a great way to build community around a shared interest. Some of the patrons who come to library events might end up playing elsewhere, a friend's home, a local game store, or online. But getting started at a library can empower people to feel confident enough to go to those other places. Libraries can help facilitate the building of a community by creating a welcoming environment for people to play and learn how to play. All right.
Awesome. That was great, Maddie. Thank you so much. So up next, we are going to have our second presentation, Freedom to Be, Trans and Gender Diverse Character Creation in Gaming with Ezekiel McGee. Ezekiel, when you're ready, go ahead and you can get started.
Hi, I'm Ezekiel McGee, and I'm presenting on trans and gender diverse character creation in gaming. Gaming of all kinds can allow us to create and build character. We can use the mechanics of games to develop a persona that operates within the game's world, while the process of adopting that persona to experience the game's story can help us practice social interactions and even conflict. This aspect of gaming allows us to experiment with values and ideas that are important to us both socially and personally. But how does this relate to the lives of trans and gender diverse individuals? Many people that possess these identities find themselves questioning not only their own thoughts about themselves and how they fit into the world, but also how they might want or need to interact with the people in their lives. These questions can be painful to face and comprehend. H. Howitt describes these feelings as the seeming contradiction of the unknown. You know and you don't know. We fear knowledge because it is often accompanied by its inconvenient friend, action to be taken. The stressors involved with developing one's gender identity make it all the more important that trans and gender diverse people can explore and experiment in a safe space. Gaming has the potential to be a space where this journey can occur. Libraries have a unique role to offer in creating an environment for gender-based gameplay, but also can help to build a community of care and knowledge for a vulnerable population. Understanding how character creation functions in various games and how trans and gender diverse people employ character creation and gameplay to meet their needs can give us a basis for how libraries might provide more relevant programming. Video games are often one of the first places that library users will encounter character creation. Robust character creation interfaces have become increasingly popular within many video game genres. However, they are a hallmark of simulation and role-playing games. On a basic level, character creation can include the ability to choose traits and features such as name, gender, clothing, weapons, etc. More expansive interfaces allow for aspects like hair color and style, sometimes including texture, eye color, body size, and shape. The most fine-tuned creators allow gamers to make even minute adjustments to physical features, often including tools like sliders to increase or decrease size of a body part, or allowing the user to click and drag their target area to adjust the shape. Additionally, clothing can include not only just a selection of entire outfits, but also the ability to choose specific items of attire as well as change their color. All of these myriad choices and aid the player in immersing themselves within a game's environment. Historically, many, if not most, character creators default to binary expressions of gender. In the past decade, however, new games have been released that do not specify a character's gender, often allowing players to choose between select body types. And many existing games have updated their software to include more options for trans and gender diverse players. These developments have come after considerable pushback from gaming communities who want to see characters in games that reflect their own lived experiences. Life simulators like The Sims 4 provide a distinct opportunity for players to create a persona that allows them to experiment with gender identity and expression. In a 2019 Polygon article, multiple trans and non-binary interviewees explain how even prior to the official changes within the game, they used various character creation tools to depict versions of themselves that had an impact on their later transitions. During the character creation process in The Sims 4's current iteration, players can choose their gender, gender expression, body type, voice pitch, and various other adjustments that impact the visual presentation of their sim. Gameplay is still a bit more limited, however. Beyond options that allow for pronoun selection, reproductive choices, and how Sims use the bathroom, there isn't much that can affirm that a Sim is trans while interacting with other Sim NPCs in the game world as a whole. To provide a more concrete example of how character creation can be utilized for trans and gender diverse expression, let's take a quick look at character creation in The Sims 4. This is what players see when they enter Create a Sim in the game. In the top left corner, you can enter in your character's name or select a random one. This is also where you can choose your character's pronouns. The default options are he, him, she, her, and they, them, but you can also create custom pronouns. Clicking the plumb bob also allows players to select their gender. By clicking the Customize option, players can refine their gender presentation. These options expand how a player's sim expresses their gender, but it is limited by the game's programming, which originally only allowed for male and female. Clicking on the sim's body opens up options for adjusting their physical shape and appearance. Under the face option, you can choose their facial shape, features, and skin color. The hair option has a variety of different styles with varying hair lengths. There are also options for facial hair, makeup, and accessories. To the left of the sim's face is the Detail Edit mode. Here you can make even finer adjustments to the sim's facial features, such as shaping their jawline or changing the lip fullness. Moving down to the rest of the sim's body, you can make even more changes, such as adjusting shoulder or hip width and increasing or decreasing muscularity or fatness. Unfortunately, this version of the game doesn't allow for height adjustments, at least at this time. There are also some preset options for body shape. Sim bodies can also have other extras, such as body hair and scars, and recent updates have added scars for top surgery and the option for body hair to grow in-game. For games that have no or limited ability for players to create characters that are trans or gender diverse, historically, one option to get around such restrictions was the use of mods, a kind of software that changes a game, usually through computer programming with software tools that are not part of the game. Players that create mods, or modders as they are typically called, can do so for a multitude of reasons, but in the case of many queer modders, their mods are designed to alter gameplay in a way that creates space and opportunities for LGBTQIA+ characters and storytelling. Incorporating mods in addition to existing mechanics fine-tunes that experience to a player's personal identity in a manner that game developers may not have the resources for or understanding of. One example is Lumpino's LGBTQIA+ gender and orientation overhaul mod for The Sims 4, which integrates a large variety of choices the player can select in-game that affirms the identity they choose for their Sims. Gender and sexual identities beyond what is available in base game can be assigned to a sim, as well as many gameplay options that allow the player to tell in-game stories that provide in-depth and nuanced exploration into a sim's queer identity. Sims 4 modders are an intriguing example of how a queer community both advocated for increased representation and employed mods to facilitate the gameplay they wanted to see. These efforts eventually led to substantive and ongoing changes made to the game that allowed for more diverse sexualities and gender portrayals. Character creation within video games can be an affirming way to visualize gender, but in many respects, players are still limited in terms of what options are available to them during this process. A game's programming, and more specifically, a game's developers, whose programming choices are always impacted by their own internal biases, places restraints on what choices can and cannot be made when creating a persona. Other forms of gaming can offer more expansive options, however, including the ability for players to not only create a visual idea of a character, but also other kinds of behavioral characteristics. According to Sarah Lynn Bowman, the most fascinating aspect of the process of role-playing lies in the ability to shift personality characteristics within the parameters of the game environment. Games and scenarios allow participants the opportunity to try on different hats of selfhood, experimenting with the adoption of personality characteristics that either amplify or contradict aspects of their primary identities. Role-playing environments provide a safe atmosphere for people to collectively enact new modes of self-expression and experience a sense of ego permeability while still maintaining their primary identity in the real world. Creating a character within a tabletop or live-action role-playing game is to some extent only limited by a player's imagination. While there are often mechanics within the game to consider, even those may be adjusted depending on the needs of the game master and the players. For a trans or gender diverse individual, then, there is an even greater opportunity to explore aspects of themselves that they may not have access to in everyday life. This aspect of gameplay may be both tempered and enhanced by the ability to play closely with others in person or increasingly online as well. It is important to note, however, that tabletop and live-action role-playing games, in addition to the spaces cultivated around these activities, are not free from bias and discrimination. Whereas within video games, the choices of how a player depicts their character cannot typically be affected by other players, most analog role-playing games have the additional challenge of needing to communicate with other people in order for the game to work. This can potentially lead to disputes about what is and isn't allowed within the game space. As a recent Autostraddle article explains, unfortunately, our internal understanding of our identity is constantly confronted and in conflict with the biases and expectations others assign to our physical bodies. If gone unexamined and unchecked, the systems of oppression that underpin our world will permeate systems within the game. At their best, however, analog role-playing games can offer transformative spaces to explore not only one's personal gender identity, but the idea of gender itself. Game designer Jay Dragon argues that when we play at gender, both in a game space and outside of it, the being we are changes. Tabletop RPGs helped me realize that all of life is character creation. My gender is another game I get to play with people around me. My identity and my pronouns are strategic tools of self-expression and some inarticulate way of gesturing towards a deeper truth that no one can see. A character is a mask, and my gender is another mask, and both of them are ways I can become something more. So how can libraries facilitate and aid trans and gender diverse users in their explorations of gender through gaming? Providing accessible space is an important place to start. Entering and welcoming spaces within libraries can be a pivotal way to find community for LGBTQIA+ individuals. As librarian Christopher Knapp insists, creating youth programming with safety, inclusion, and a welcoming atmosphere in mind benefits all youth who intend to come to library programming because it makes it a place that is fun and ideal to come back to again and again, whether in person or virtually. While gaming of any kind can certainly add to the fun aspect Knapp mentions, incorporating games that include a character creation dimension can provide a low-stakes way for trans and gender diverse persons to explore things like body shape and size, clothing, and even voice tone and pitch. And because this exploration is being conducted within the context of a game, users have control over how much emphasis, if any, they place on their real-life identities. Furthermore, if librarians can help to establish the library as a safe place and explore and ask questions, trans and gender diverse users are much more likely to return and even ask for resources that might support them in their transitions. Establishing that people within the library are safe is just as needed as demonstrating the safety of the space. Gaming is also a dynamic way to build community and can do so with people from various backgrounds and interests. By having a shared interest in gaming as an activity, trans and gender diverse users can encounter others that may be exploring their own gender identities or people that could be potential allies. This open participation reflects similar projects that have attempted to use libraries as sites of community for these groups. In an article discussing trans and gender diverse programming in Spain, the authors remarked that it is necessary to actively promote the creation of new knowledge and ways of being. This new knowledge needs to be created by facilitating places where the local and LGBTQ+ communities can get together and create dialogue in a setting of mutual recognition, respect, and validation. Character creation through gaming can allow trans and gender diverse users to create new and even shared narratives about their lives and experiences, and the library can act as a place for further collaboration both within and beyond their community. This presentation really only scratches the surface of how to engage trans and gender diverse users through gaming. Other types of gaming, such as live-action role-playing, are fruitful avenues to explore, in addition to how different kinds of libraries might use gaming in their programming. I'm certain school and academic libraries have many interesting ways to use character creation through educational role-playing, for example. I encourage you all to explore programming that might work for your own spaces, and that the connections you make with trans and gender diverse users make your library safer, open, and more vibrant for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ezekiel. So if you have questions, remember to put those in Q&A. We're going to move into the third presentation for this session block, and that is going to be Katriel Paige presenting on A Seat at the Table, Accessibility, and Tabletop. The stage is yours, Katriel.
There we go. So hi, I'm Katriel Paige. Just gonna, some of these slides I can skip. They're just introduction slides. So disability studies, lived experience. But when we talk about accessibility, especially in a talk like this or in a library, I'm using it in a very specific way, and that is talking about accessibility as making services and information usable for people with disabilities. And as mentioned in that graph, it relates to many things: information, built environment. I've seen economic accessibility mentioned previously in previous talks as well. There's also the social impact of, especially when you talk about disability, there's a medicalization aspect. For example, neurodiverse folk often resist being told that they have disabilities because of just variety of how brains work. But I'm using it as a very broad statement here when we talk about information accessibility. That's what I'm concentrating on. And in terms of gaming and tabletop gaming specifically, there are several challenges, and we can kind of keep going. Like I said, some of these slides are basic. Keep these overlapping factors in mind. For things like information accessibility, there are current standards, but they're often not adhered to. For example, there is a gap between attitudes and priority, and laws and standards such as the Standard of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, US Section 508, which is about information and communication technologies, the ADA, and so forth. And I say that because there are standards relating to various impairments, situational, ambient sound. I myself have chronic pain, so mobility is a major issue, like carrying 5 RPG books is now a problem for me. And one of the major challenges comes into play here. So we can move on. These slides will be available. Useful statistics, especially for librarians, is that before COVID-19, the estimated 1 out of 5 people worldwide had some form of disability or impairment. Unfortunately, that number has gone up. We're still finding out more things about long COVID symptoms, brain fog, and it definitely exposed the results of barriers and the prevalence of inaccessibility online, ranging from even making appointments to accessing services. We're still learning about those impacts now, but you may have heard about some of these things, particularly if you interface with other government agencies or people asking for services or dealing with just things like family illness or chronic pain or memory issues. And how does this all relate to tabletop? Well, let's keep going. Tabletop, especially nowadays, uses a lot of technology, and we'll get to PDFs in a second, but things like Roll20, the virtual tabletop software, that's all technology. Obviously, it's web-based. Foundry is web-based or software-based. There's also technology used in scheduling assistance, such as Warhorn or startplaying.games, where you could sign up for sessions and it helps with scheduling. Sometimes events or institutions like libraries or, say, school clubs will use these resources. There are also resources like D&D Beyond. And a lot of game books and adventures now have a print form and PDFs. So technology is rampant. What do we do about making sure that this is accessible? So there are a lot of challenges here. This is just a brief overview. For libraries specifically, there's physical accessibility of the space. There's public transit. There's the cost of any software needed. For example, a lot of the JAWS screen reader software, a personal license now varies because they've changed their model. But without counting the Windows computer you would need to run it on, the JAWS screen reader can run up to about $1,000 for a single license. Cost of any software needed, budget cuts, inventory challenges, information management, so on and so forth. Add to that existing tabletop challenges for accessibility, such as for the information side, no virtual tabletop such as Roll20 or Foundry were accessible for blind players, even when they used things like screen reader software, because of how those virtual tabletop platforms were coded. Because of the prevalence of PDFs, especially in tabletop gaming, only recently, as in the last 2 weeks, as we were putting this conference together, Affinity now is only having support for tagging PDFs. So that means that if you have a paragraph of text in a PDF, it will actually read to screen readers as a paragraph of text and not a header or an image or things of that sort. There are also legal requirements. For example, community content for certain programs like Storyteller's Vault, which is the platform for White Wolf, things like Vampire the Masquerade, and so on, often require legal requirements for community content for copyright law and such. DM's Guild is the same way for Dungeons and Dragons. That's another community content program. These legal templates may not have accessibility in mind of the resulting document. Some tabletop publishers are doing great with accessible PDFs. Darrington Press. What Darrington Press is the publishing arm, most often associated with Critical Role. They're the ones who published Tal'Dorei Reborn. They had 2 accessibility consultants, one of which just did PDF accessibility document consulting. So that is an example. There's also the challenge of representation, and we will address these in the 5 ways to increase accessibility. There's an information accessibility problem, and there's a representation issue. And the first way to improve accessibility, especially in a library, is do allow that phone or technology. For example, decide on tools beforehand. If you know that you're going to use Roll20 to help you with dice rolls, for example, or maps, say, hey, this game session or mini campaign, we're planning on using Roll20. We're doing, campaign sharing or something like that. Let people know beforehand or in the description in advance if possible. If a tool is unfamiliar to players, consider going through the tools together. As long as the player is still engaged, let them bring fidget toys or like crochet or knitting. I know people also sometimes will disclaim the tools they use. I play with somebody who uses a hearing aid, and so anytime there is a game that pipes through Discord, for example, for voice chat, he has to basically say, I'm using a hearing aid. Please let me know if you needed something repeated, because I have to do my audio setup a certain way. Also, making sure that turn taking or other ways to communicate might be accessible. I mostly use this for hybrid methods. For example, like Discord and using Roll20 or whatever the setup might be. You might also want to take a look at having people write out their questions or use the text channel, because that also helps people avoid the issues, especially if you're running the game, of having the most outgoing person control the session. People can write in text, and that's also a little bit more accessible if you have multiple methods of communication open, both for neurodiverse players or GMs, and just to make sure that, you know, sometimes you might want to have spell descriptions, you know, written out and say, I'm using this spell, let's go over it. Or I have a question, but somebody's in the middle of a description or talking. That way they can still participate without feeling left out. So multiple methods. Ensure physical access, and this sounds really simplistic, but it's still important. Check the physical table locations. Do not block paths if you can avoid it. Double check any tech setups you might need. Also, check that any dice you are using, if you are using physical dice, have high enough contrast. I love pretty dice, but some of them, you cannot read them. I have played tabletop gaming since the 90s, and yeah, I wear glasses. And this also applies no matter the age. Young children might have issues as well as older people. Just, it helps everyone out. Relates to point one, some people may already have tools like electronic character sheets that they use. Maybe you just have a session 0 and go over that. I will refer to that sort of session 0 idea as well later. But physical table locations, mobility aids, wheelchairs, tech setups, just ensure that sort of physical access of, can you read the dice? Can somebody sit at the table? That sort of concern. And the next one is preserve player agency. And this is a big one, especially with representation. Just because a player might have, say, panic attacks does not necessarily mean that they want their character to. But whether or not a character has a disability or impairment, limb difference, mobility issues, whatever the case is, should always be left up for the character's player. That way they can decide whether they want to represent that or not. And if the player does want to represent some aspect, work with them. For example, don't lock out class or character selection due to choice of representation. This has actually come up in official statements for Dungeons and Dragons, especially in organized play, same with Pathfinder, where they had to point out that if you have a fighter that uses a two-headed weapon, that fighter can still use that weapon, even if that fighter has a limb difference in terms of representation or uses a prosthetic. They've actually had to make statements in organized play saying, please don't lock out, you know, or penalize players for this. That might also be a conversation about what disability might look like, and that there are many things like depression that doesn't have a particular look. You can't always look at someone and say that they're disabled or have an impairment or chronic pain, whatever the case is. So please preserve player agency and keep that in mind as much as possible. The next one. There are some examples here. Legend Lore actually is very good about this. So disclaimer, I was one of the writers on it, but one of their signature characters includes a veteran who's hijabi. So where's the hijab? Is a veteran who uses a wheelchair. And when they go into the other world, the world that the game takes place in, that wheelchair gets preserved. They actually have in the game book itself saying, if you wear glasses, you can choose whether or not to keep them. Hearing aids still work, but you don't have to bring them. It's that idea of your self-image. I wear glasses. That is my sense of self. If I'm playing myself, I would want those glasses with me. So they do actually address this in this game book. There are other games that will address this idea as well. So that's sort of an example section. Learn about safety tools if you are not familiar with them already. Some of these things are often associated with phobias. For example, arachnophobia, a monster can just be reflavored, an icon change to not be a spider. Other things, especially if you're playing games like Call of Cthulhu or Vampire the Masquerade, because these are personal horror games or psychological horror, or it might even have a madness mechanic, such as in Call of Cthulhu, you might want to go over safety tools and have them at your table. Or things like if an adventure mentions bullying or blackmail, you might want to look into safety tools and content warnings. So if you're crossing sort of a hard line, especially in the case of, say, bullying as an example, you can kind of bring it back or say these things are off limits completely, these things we can approach, and there are resources about that. I just included some of the more common ones. The other way is to use these as teaching moments. So for example, character sheets, they can be even customized. Some people, color coding your character sheet works amazing. Other people cannot stand it. So this would actually be a great way to go over, say, a character sheet and how to create a character in a game, and then letting people sort of customize their own sheets. I know people that sort of draw in icons like hearts for your character's health. That would be a great sort of session to do just on its own. Or you can also use this as book recommendations or series recommendations. The Witcher is a good example of a main character who has chronic pain and injuries that never quite healed right. Lord of the Rings is actually famous for depicting war and trauma in a very particular way. Percy Jackson series, Avatar: The Last Airbender, and Legend of Korra as well. You could use these as sort of teaching moments in various ways, not just for trauma or neurodivergence, but also things like there's a famous sequence in there, Avatar: The Last Airbender, about somebody who uses a modified wheelchair. The character of Toph is a great example because it's brought up, but used as sort of, it's always there for the character, but it doesn't mean that this character has to necessarily be always pitiful or always needing help. They each have their strengths. So you could definitely use games as a teaching moment in that sense, or book recommendations, or here's how to learn more. So I know that's fast. There's a lot of other resources. The Fate Accessibility Toolkit is meant for the Fate system of games, but I recommend it for a bunch of other systems as well. Critical Role has depictions of grief, death, interesting depiction of PTSD, both narrative and mechanically. So that could be used as a teaching moment. There are other things like learning more about universal design or other recommendations as well. So I hope that helps improve the accessibility at your table and at your games. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Katriel. So if I can have my other presenters from this block turn your mics and your cameras back on, we will get through our Q&A session. Let me close a couple screens I have open and I will get our questions pulled up. And if you still have questions for our panelists, please go ahead and throw them into the Q&A feature. And if you are watching on Twitch, our Twitch team will get those over to us so we can ask them here in Zoom. So let's see here. Let me pull up Q&A really quick. All right. So I think this is a general question for any of you to answer, but have you seen role-playing game mechanics for including service animals? This person says that they feel like the
Yes.
D&D Ranger companions come close, but not all the way. So maybe Kat and then Madi and then Ezekiel, if you have responses to that.
I actually have a longer version of this presentation where I go over things like that. And one of them is familiars. Can be used as service animals, especially if they're trained to like alert on a character. I would go over that with your GM, but I have seen mechanics for that. There's also a third-party book, I believe, called something Heroes or Heroic something. It's full of disability mechanics for D&D. I personally tend to use a mix of mechanics and narrative. I tend to not go too heavy on the mechanics, but there are definitely solutions there, especially for service animals, depending on what that animal kind of wants to represent. in terms of alerts or tasks involved. Raid your companions is the first thing that people think of, though, but I've seen it done different ways.
Maddie, did you have anything to add to that? Or
I think
Ezekiel?
the find familiar spell in D&D can be a great way to do that. It's one that I've seen used before. You're able to use your familiar's senses rather than your own, as long as they stay close to you. So that could be a
I've
great way.
also seen the Artificer Steel Defender used that way as
Yes.
well. Mhm.
So this isn't from tabletop RPGs, but in simulation games, especially in The Sims, there have been a variety of different mods that have been created that have assistive devices. I know there was at one point someone that created a mod that integrated a wheelchair, and also the game that itself has integrated different medical devices that you can have your somewhere. So like a diabetic monitor, hearing aids, and things of that sort.
I've also seen actually one of the examples in my slides was there was the same person who used the hearing aid represented his characters as having hearing aids as well, and they were elves, so he would like have them as like little flower ornaments almost, and would change depending on the kind of elf it was. I've also seen assistive tech being represented different ways, both mechanically. In Pathfinder Society, which is the organized play for Pathfinder, they actually say your character just has these for free if they need an assistive device, whether it's a prosthetic or things like a cane or a walking stick. They actually have a sort of mechanical solution for that. I have seen depictions, various classes using assistive devices, or I don't want to say technology, but like used it in different ways. I've seen chronic pain being represented by somebody chose a necromancer class or blood hunter for that reason. The combat wheelchair is actually a fairly well-known thing, both in terms of modeling in, say, Hero Forge, which does minis, but also for D&D or D&D like games. I do know that it's also a canon thing in Cyberpunk Red, because the same person had done it professionally as a freelancer for Cyberpunk Red. There's also assistive tech addressed in Legend lore and in Dystopia Rising Evolution, including a modding mechanic. It's part of their crafting mechanic as well. And they said if you storytellers are empowered to say, hey, if somebody wants to use their cane and they're in melee and they want to use it as a melee weapon as well, you can do that. There's plenty of modding opportunities, as well as representing assistive devices and service animals in different games. It's becoming more, I don't want to say more prevalent, but it's starting to be there, it's starting to be represented.
Yeah, definitely a lot more examples out there.
Right, than
So
there
our
used to
next
be.
question,
Yeah.
our next question is specifically from Maddie. What tabletop role-playing games do you think do a really great job of community building that are particularly fun for intergenerational play?
One thing that I have seen that's actually been interesting has been D&D, because it's been so long lasting. There are people who go, oh, I used to play this when I was in high school, and now I'm playing it at home with my grandchildren or with my children. That can be really great. Otherwise, there are games that are sort of based on different media that can be really fun. Avatar Legends is maybe a little bit newer, but there's also games based on like Firefly, for instance, where someone may have said, hey, I used to watch this. Let's play this game now.
Awesome. So next we have a question for Ezekiel. What would you like to see designers change or shift in game design to improve character creation options, as well as offer more interesting interactions based on these creation options in gameplay?
I mean, to start off with, especially this goes for video games, I think more than anything, remove gender restricted play like entirely. There's really no reason for it. I mean, even Animal Crossing has gotten rid of that at this point. But it's still a significant issue that pops up in some games, and it shouldn't be up to fans to mod the games in order to make it more accessible in that way. But also, when it comes to like the interactions in game, there should be more ways to like address the fact that like a character is not a normative gender. The mod that I mentioned by Lumpino kind of like really goes like above and beyond to integrate that into the Sims. But like in other games as well, like Stardew Valley, like people have invented mods like to make all of the interactions like gender neutral, and like that should really be the default if that's what the player wants. Um, I don't want to like discount people that want to like be cisgendered within a game, but there should be like those options in advance rather than like the modding community constantly has to pick up the slack.
Fully agree. Um, this next question is another question for Madison. Could you tell us more about how you employed some of the community building techniques you talked about, like the example you mentioned with the RPG speed dating sessions?
Yeah, so that was a event that I sort of helped with. It's not one that I led, but at that event, it was a event that we had done after at the end of the workday, so that more people would be able to participate. And we had basically set out a bunch of different rule books with little cards in front of them that were their dating profiles. So that one was, this is Goblin Quest. Here's what Goblin Quest is like. Here is Kids on Brooms, which is a Kids on Bikes variant. Here's what that one looks like. And then we've played a couple of games as well. We did Delivery Dragons there, and then Tiniest Wizard. And that was a way for us to kind of introduce some games, but also introduce people to playing games like that.
I love Tiniest Wizard so much. Like, if you haven't played it, go look it up. Like Maddie said earlier, it fits on a business card and it's super easy to learn, and it's great to play even like a physical game space because you can turn your room like into a LARPish environment almost. It's really great. Um, so this question is for Katriel. You mentioned a session 0. What are some
Yes.
ways to highlight accessibility during a session 0, and how would you make it clear without making players feel like they have to share their preferences or um, lived experience with a larger group?
That gets tricky. And especially, so if it's a case of accessing the information, a lot of times people who are like, I already use Roll20 or I already use D&D Beyond, they're familiar with it. They will kind of already have their tool preferences or their setup preferences. But if it's a case of representation, especially in things like session 0, if you're going over safety tools, you might be like, well, do I really want to mention that I have, God forbid, anything like child abuse or something like that, right? You don't want to have people necessarily give their, own experiences at that session 0, but you can say, hey, this campaign might touch on things like harm to children. Do we have that on screen, or we have it sort of lines and veils style where we might mention it, but if it's off screen, it's just a mention, we move on, right? So that could be a way of doing it. Especially if you're playing adventures that are pre-written, it could be easier to go over those adventures and say, okay, what's a hard no? What's on screen? What's off screen? What's a mention only? That's where lines and veils is a popular tool used, especially in conversation with other things. For representation also, I've actually never had a problem with people be like, I have, I want to make a character with chronic pain. Okay, you do you. Or, something like that. And that also kind of relates to what Ezekiel was saying about character creation, especially, and sort of being able to play in that space of really kind of playing with the space of what would a character look like and what do I want to bring to it. I say as a queer disabled person myself, there's a lot of intersection there. Sometimes, and bringing back to character creation, sometimes that extends to, maybe you don't have a character who needs necessarily like a diabetic monitor or something like that, but maybe you can sort of approximate, hey, I have this character concept, what would work? Or, hey, this sounds really fun. How can we sort of model this? What's kind of people comfortable with? And you might get some pushback, especially from other players. But that's why I put in that teaching moment part. If the library is known as a safe space, and especially the people that you're with or who is leading it, being able to bring up those conversations, even if the person decides not to kind of pursue that avenue of representation, just having that conversation in the first place is so important.
Yeah, session zeros are super helpful, especially, I mean,
Yeah.
always doing them, but especially when you're playing in a public group, like at a library,
Yes.
you want to get all those things out on the table ahead of time so everybody has a clear expectation of the kind of game and experience that they're walking into.
Right.
And that we are at the top of the hour, so that is all the time we have for questions right now. But if you have further questions for our panelists, you can pop those into our Discord chat. Someone will put the link to that in the chat, hopefully Danielle. And then don't forget that we also have a feedback survey. We would love for everybody attending to give some feedback to all of our presenters today. You can fill that out more than once so that you can give every presenter feedback if you would like. And there's a nice incentive. Anybody who fills it out will get a digital copy of Quest Giver, which is just a quest generating tool that I had created. And then anybody who submits also will earn entries into a drawing that we're doing for that Magpie Games bundle that is currently on Humble Bundle. And there's lots of really great stuff in there, including the Avatar role-playing game, which has been mentioned a couple times just during this session. So please go ahead and fill out that survey. And we are going to be taking a break before our final session tonight. So please go hydrate, make sure you've eaten today, go take a stretch and come back, and we will see you at 5 p.m. Central for our final session of this March mini conference. Thank you again to all of our presenters. You had great presentations today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.